The war had reached its most devastating point. The island of Okinawa had become a battleground where destruction seemed endless, and hope was an unfamiliar concept to both the soldiers and the civilians who lived there. As American forces landed on the island, Japanese citizens were already deeply entrenched in fear, their lives shattered by years of relentless war propaganda. Every Japanese soldier had been portrayed as a hero fighting for the emperor's honor, while every American was painted as a demon, a ruthless invader who would stop at nothing to conquer and destroy. Jackson Williams had been a part of the invading American forces. He had been deployed to Okinawa with the promise of victory, but as the days passed, he found himself wading through death and despair. He had already seen too much: the mangled bodies of his comrades and the ever-growing number of Japanese civilians who were caught in the crossfire. The brutality of war was no stranger to him, but nothing could have prepared him for the chaos and intensity of the battles that raged on Okinawa. With each passing day, it seemed that the war would never end. Jackson had been wounded in the early stages of the battle. A piece of shrapnel had struck his leg, and although he tried to ignore the pain, it only grew worse as the hours passed. His movements were slower, his body weaker, but his determination remained. The war was not just about survival for him. It was about completing his mission, about ensuring that his comrades would have the chance to see the end of the fighting. The idea of surrender was incomprehensible to Jackson. He was a soldier, and his duty was clear. The landscape around him was a landscape of ruin. What had once been a peaceful island was now a hellscape of burning buildings, shattered roads, and destroyed homes. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of gunfire echoed constantly in the background. Jackson moved through the wreckage, carefully stepping over fallen debris, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The once vibrant island was now a desolate wasteland, and the survivors, soldiers and civilians alike, were nothing more than ghosts haunting the ruins. In the midst of the chaos, Jackson's mind occasionally wandered back to the mission he had been given. He was part of a small team tasked with searching for survivors, both soldiers and civilians. It was a grueling task, one that required him to put his own suffering aside in order to help those in need. But even in the midst of his own physical pain, Jackson felt a sense of responsibility to help. After all, it wasn't just the soldiers who were suffering. The civilians, too, were caught in the conflict, facing horrors they had never known. As Jackson moved deeper into the village, the sounds of the battlefield grew louder. The air was filled with the noise of artillery, the screech of bombs falling from the sky, and the crackle of gunfire. Every corner he turned seemed to bring him closer to the heart of the fighting. But Jackson wasn't concerned with the sounds of battle. He had learned to block them out, focusing instead on his task. He had a job to do, and nothing, not even the deafening sounds of war, was going to distract him from that. The village was eerily quiet as Jackson entered it. The buildings that had once housed families were now reduced to rubble, and the streets were littered with debris. He could hear the occasional cry of a child in the distance, but it was quickly drowned out by the sounds of ongoing explosions. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life, just the aftermath of war. Jackson continued to push forward, determined to find any survivors. He had seen too many lives lost already. He couldn't let it happen again. Suddenly, Jackson froze. In the distance, he thought he saw movement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. His heart raced as he crept closer, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The movement was closer now, and Jackson could make out the silhouette of a figure. It wasn't a soldier, nor was it a civilian. It was a woman, crouched low to the ground, moving cautiously through the wreckage. Jackson's instincts kicked in. He moved toward her, slowly and carefully, trying not to make a sound. As he got closer, Jackson could see the woman more clearly. She was young, no older than 20, and her face was streaked with dirt and blood. She was barefoot, her clothes torn and ragged. Jackson could see that she was struggling to move, her face twisted in pain. It was clear that she was injured, but she wasn't stopping. Despite her injuries, she was determined to keep going, to survive. Jackson's heart went out to her. He knew that the situation in Okinawa was dire, but he had never expected to find someone like her. She wasn't a soldier, nor was she a member of the military. She was just a civilian, caught in the middle of a war that wasn't her fault. As Jackson watched her, he felt a pang of guilt. He had been taught to view the Japanese as the enemy, but here, in front of him, was a woman struggling to survive just like he was. The lines between right and wrong, enemy and ally, had become blurred in this place. For a moment, Jackson hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do. His orders had been clear. He was supposed to focus on finding and saving American soldiers, not civilians. But something in him refused to walk away from this woman. She needed help. He could see it in her eyes. With a deep breath, Jackson moved toward her, reaching out a hand. She turned sharply, her eyes wide with fear. But when she saw that he was an American soldier, her expression shifted. It was a mixture of relief and confusion. Jackson could see that she was struggling to speak, but her words were lost in the wind. He leaned in closer, trying to make out what she was saying. Her voice was weak, but it carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. She was asking for help, and Jackson knew that there was no turning back. Despite his own pain, despite the chaos around him, he had to help her. As Jackson reached out to support her, he knew that this moment would change everything. He had entered this war as an enemy, but now he was faced with a decision that transcended nationalities, transcended the war itself. In this moment, it was not about being American or Japanese. It was about humanity. And Jackson, for the first time since the war began, had to ask himself what it truly meant to be a soldier. Jackson's hand trembled slightly as he reached out to the young woman, his senses heightened by the ever-present sounds of gunfire in the distance. He had seen civilians before, but never up close, and certainly never like this. This woman wasn't like the faceless enemies he had been taught to fight. She was human, fragile, and in desperate need of help, just like he had been when he first arrived on Okinawa. As he moved closer to her, his mind raced with conflicting thoughts. He wasn't supposed to help her. He was a soldier on a mission, not a medic. Yet something in his gut told him he couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. She was still wary, eyes darting between him and the debris-filled street. Her breath was shallow, as if every movement caused her pain. Jackson could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty of what he might do. He had been raised to believe that the enemy was a monster, but standing in front of him was a woman who looked no different from the women and children back home. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister. In that instant, Jackson felt the weight of his own beliefs shift, if only for a moment. He took another step forward, speaking softly to her in broken Japanese, unsure of whether she would understand. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though his words felt foreign even to himself. His accent was clumsy, and the sound of his own voice seemed out of place in the devastation that surrounded them. She didn't respond, but her eyes softened ever so slightly, her tense shoulders relaxing. She had heard his voice, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was beginning to trust him. The moment stretched, thick with tension. Jackson knew he had to act quickly, but he didn't want to scare her more than she already was. He gently extended his hand to her once again, this time more slowly, trying to convey that he wasn't a threat. Her eyes flickered between his hand and his face, and for a brief second she hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached out, her hand shaking as it brushed against his. Jackson could feel the weight of that touch, the fragile, tentative connection between two people caught in a war they hadn't chosen. "Can you walk?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The woman's eyes dropped to the ground as if the weight of his question had finally registered. Jackson noticed that she was barefoot, her feet bruised and bloodied from the rough terrain. He didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he gently supported her, taking the weight of her frail body in his arms as she tried to push herself to her feet. She winced with pain, but she didn't cry out, her jaw clenched in silent determination. Jackson wasn't sure if she was trying to protect him from the sound of her pain, or if it was simply the stoic resolve of someone who had endured too much already. As they moved slowly through the rubble-strewn street, Jackson kept his guard up, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The village, once bustling with life, was now eerily silent, save for the occasional distant rumble of artillery. They passed buildings reduced to smoldering ruins, their skeletons rising like ghosts from the earth. Jackson could feel the weight of the destruction bearing down on him, a reminder of what war did to the world. It wasn't just soldiers who died in battle. Entire lives, entire communities were erased with each bomb that fell, each shell that exploded. They turned a corner, and Jackson heard the unmistakable sound of a bullet ricocheting off a nearby wall. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively pulled the woman closer to him, using his body to shield her from whatever danger was lurking ahead. For a brief moment, he forgot about the pain in his leg, the bleeding wound that had been steadily worsening since he first took it. His focus was entirely on her, on getting her to safety, on ensuring that she survived. He had no idea if he would survive himself, but it didn't matter. His only concern now was her. "Stay close," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of distant explosions. She nodded, her expression still tight with fear, but her steps were more sure now, more confident. For a brief moment, Jackson allowed himself to believe that they might make it out of this alive. He didn't know how long the battle would last, or if they would even survive the day. But in that moment, there was a sliver of hope, a tiny spark of humanity in the midst of the destruction. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was no need for words. They both understood what the other needed: survival, safety, and a chance at something better than the horrors of war. Jackson's thoughts drifted briefly to his own family back home, the ones he hadn't seen in so long. He wondered what they were doing, if they even knew he was still alive. He tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the woman beside him, on the task at hand. They continued moving through the wreckage, the weight of the world on their shoulders. Jackson's mind raced, calculating the distance to the nearest safe zone, but the path seemed endless. The streets were littered with debris, and every corner seemed to hold a new threat. He had to keep moving, keep his focus, but it was hard when every step felt like a gamble. Still, he pressed on. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, makeshift shelter. Jackson's legs were trembling with exhaustion, his body protesting every movement, but he didn't stop. He helped the woman inside, where a few other survivors were huddled together, their faces worn with fear and uncertainty. The air inside the shelter was thick with tension, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. They had made it this far. They had survived. As Jackson collapsed to the ground, his body finally giving in to the pain, he looked at the woman beside him. Her face was still pale, her body still trembling, but there was something different in her eyes now. It wasn't just fear, it was gratitude. She had survived. They both had. And in that moment, Jackson realized that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to life than the battle. There was humanity, compassion, and a shared desire to survive. And in this war-torn world, that was something worth fighting for. The makeshift shelter was a grim reminder of the reality they lived in, a fragile haven surrounded by destruction. Inside, the air was heavy, filled with the smell of dust, sweat, and fear. The walls, if they could even be called that, were made from whatever materials the survivors could find: broken boards, scrap metal, and remnants of buildings that had once stood strong. Jackson's eyes scanned the room, noting the quiet faces of those who had been hiding in the rubble, their bodies worn down by hunger, fear, and the constant threat of death. They were all survivors, yet none of them were truly free. He collapsed onto a pile of torn blankets in the corner of the shelter, his body aching from the exertion of carrying the woman through the wreckage. His leg, still bleeding, was a constant reminder of the price he had paid just to reach this point. But as he lay there, he didn't allow himself to focus on the pain. He couldn't afford to. There were more important things to think about now, things that were beyond the battle itself. His mind shifted to the woman beside him, who was now resting, her body trembling, but no longer with fear. It was exhaustion, pure and simple. She had been through so much, just like him. Jackson's attention turned to the others in the room. They were watching him, waiting for something. What, exactly, he wasn't sure. Maybe they were waiting for hope, for some sign that they would survive this hell. But Jackson didn't have any answers to give them. He was just as lost as they were. The war had stripped away any semblance of normalcy, leaving them with nothing but the barest instinct to survive. He could see it in their eyes, the same fear, the same uncertainty that haunted him. "Do you need anything?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the woman or the others. His words felt hollow in the oppressive silence of the room. No one responded immediately. The woman beside him turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew that there was nothing left to ask for except survival. They had no food, no medicine, and no way of knowing when or if the battle would end. All they had was each other, and for now, that would have to be enough. The tension in the room grew thick as the minutes passed. Outside, the sounds of the war were a constant reminder of the world they were trapped in. The distant explosions, the rattling of gunfire. It was all so familiar, yet so distant now. It felt as though the war had become a part of them, woven into the very fabric of their lives. Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise, but it was impossible. The sounds of the battlefield were as much a part of him now as the blood that still stained his uniform. He opened his eyes again, focusing on the woman. She was still breathing heavily, her face pale from the strain, but there was something different in her eyes now. There was a flicker of something that hadn't been there before, something like trust. It was a small thing, but it meant more to Jackson than he could explain. In the midst of everything, she had allowed herself to trust him. She had let him help her when she could have turned away, when she could have believed that he was just another enemy. But she hadn't, and for some reason, that meant everything to him. The silence between them grew longer, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding. They both knew that they had to stay still, to remain quiet, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The walls of the shelter felt like they were closing in around them, suffocating them with the weight of the war. But in that silence, there was a kind of peace. It was fragile, but it was real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jackson allowed himself to breathe, even if only for a moment. Outside, the rumble of artillery grew louder, and Jackson felt a twinge of fear. He knew that they were still at risk. They were still trapped in the middle of a battlefield, and their shelter wasn't going to protect them forever. But right now, there was nothing he could do. His body was worn out, and his mind was racing with thoughts of what might come next. The woman beside him was resting now, but he knew that the next few hours, or even minutes, could bring more danger. He had to be ready. They both had to be ready. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the shelter, Jackson's thoughts wandered back to the larger picture. He thought of the war, of the soldiers fighting outside, and of the civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. He thought of the family he had left behind, of the life he had once known. Everything had changed so quickly. It seemed as though the world had been turned upside down in a matter of days, and now survival was the only thing that mattered. There was no room for anything else, no room for ideals, for politics, for even hope, just survival. But despite the overwhelming sense of despair, despite the hopelessness that threatened to swallow him whole, Jackson found himself clinging to one thing, the woman beside him. She was a symbol of something he hadn't realized he still believed in: humanity, compassion, connection. In the middle of the violence, they had found something that wasn't about fighting, about winning or losing. It was about helping each other, about being there for someone else, even in the darkest of times. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but in that moment, it was enough. As the night grew colder, Jackson pulled the thin blanket over himself and the woman beside him. They had both been through so much already, but the night would bring new challenges. They couldn't let their guard down, not yet. The war was still out there, still raging. But in the quiet of the shelter, with the woman's fragile breath against his shoulder, Jackson allowed himself one final thought before sleep overtook him. They were alive. They had made it this far, and for now, that was enough. The morning light crept through the cracks in the shelter, casting weak rays across the dusty floor. Jackson woke up with a start, his body stiff from the cold and the weight of his injuries. His leg throbbed painfully, and his shoulder, still tender from the shrapnel wound, felt like it had been frozen in place. The sounds of war were distant but unmistakable. Gunfire, explosions, the eerie hum of a battlefield that never truly rested. The woman beside him stirred slightly, her breath shallow, but she was still asleep, exhausted from the strain of the previous night. Jackson's eyes flickered to her, and he couldn't help but wonder if she had any hope left. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford, but somehow she had managed to hold on to it. He gently shifted his weight, careful not to disturb her, and surveyed their surroundings. The shelter was small and cramped, offering little protection from the outside world. The walls were barely standing, constructed hastily from broken pieces of wood and metal scavenged from the wreckage. It had once been a home, a place of warmth and family. Now it was nothing more than a cold, lifeless refuge from the war that had consumed everything. Jackson's gaze lingered on the debris outside the shelter, burnt-out vehicles, collapsed houses, and the remnants of a life that had been torn apart by conflict. The world they had known was gone, and all that remained was this suffocating sense of survival. He shifted his position slightly, testing his leg. The pain was sharp, but it was manageable. He had to move. The longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. The artillery fire that had been constant the day before had finally stopped, but Jackson knew it wasn't over. The enemy was still close, and the Americans were making their push deeper into the island. They couldn't afford to wait any longer. The thought of escaping, of finding safety, had been on Jackson's mind since the moment he had arrived at this hellhole. But now, with the woman beside him, it felt more urgent than ever. He couldn't leave her behind. He couldn't leave anyone behind. The first step, Jackson knew, was to get her moving. She hadn't woken up yet, and he didn't want to alarm her. But they couldn't wait. Every minute spent in this shelter brought them closer to discovery, and the enemy was always just one step behind. Jackson could feel the sweat beading on his forehead as he pushed himself to his feet, trying to ignore the dizziness that came with the movement. His body was weak, but there was no time to rest. They had to go. They had to keep moving. He gently placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, his fingers brushing against her torn clothing. She flinched at first, and Jackson held his breath, hoping she wouldn't panic. But when she opened her eyes, They weren't filled with the terror he had expected. Instead, there was a quiet recognition, a sense of understanding that needed no words. Her face was pale, her features drawn, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was trust. Maybe it was the shared experience of being alive in a world that had forgotten what peace looked like. Whatever it was, Jackson didn't question it. He simply nodded, and she slowly began to sit up, her body stiff but determined. "We have to go," Jackson said, his voice low and steady. The words felt heavy in the air, like they carried the weight of everything that had happened. The woman didn't respond immediately, but she stood up with surprising grace, despite the exhaustion and the injuries she had suffered. Her eyes flickered around the shelter, taking in their surroundings as though she were saying goodbye to the life she had known. Jackson's heart ached at the thought. They were both leaving behind something, maybe even everything, just to survive. Together, they stepped outside into the wreckage, the dust swirling around their feet. Jackson kept his hand on the woman's arm, guiding her through the rubble. It felt like walking through a graveyard. Every step they took was a step further from the life they had once known. The world around them was dead, suffocating in the aftermath of war. But as they walked, there was a strange kind of peace that settled over Jackson. Maybe it was the quiet resolve in the woman's eyes. Maybe it was the realization that, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone in this. The road ahead was treacherous. Every turn held the possibility of danger. Jackson had been trained for combat, but he had never been trained for this journey of survival, this fight for life in a world that had lost its sense of humanity. He scanned their surroundings constantly, keeping an eye out for any sign of movement, any hint of the enemy. But it was quiet now. The distant sounds of battle were still there, but they were farther off. For the moment, they were safe. Jackson's legs slowed him down, and he could feel the blood soaking into his clothes. He needed medical attention, but there was no time for that. His mission was clear: get to safety and get this woman to safety. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. She was counting on him. And for some reason, in the midst of the chaos, he found himself willing to carry that weight. The woman stumbled slightly, and Jackson instinctively reached out to steady her. She looked at him with a faint smile, one that was barely there, but still somehow reassuring. In that moment, he realized how much she had already been through. They were both soldiers in their own right, fighting a war that had taken everything from them. But there was still a flicker of something between them, a shared sense of survival, of defiance against the world that had tried to crush them. They reached a small hill that overlooked the valley below. Jackson paused for a moment, looking out over the landscape. The devastation stretched as far as the eye could see, the ruins of the village scattered like broken toys on the ground. It was hard to believe that life had ever existed here. Yet somehow they had made it this far. They had survived. And maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive. But Jackson knew the road ahead would be even more dangerous. They had to cross through enemy lines, past checkpoints, and into the unknown. There was no guarantee of safety. But as he looked down at the woman beside him, her face full of quiet determination, he knew they had one thing in their favor: each other. And that, in the end, might be enough to get them through the hell that awaited. The path ahead was fraught with danger, and as Jackson and the woman moved deeper into the village, they could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them. The air was thick with dust, the remnants of bombed-out buildings rising like jagged teeth from the earth. Jackson's leg ached with every step, the blood from his wound now staining his pants and leaving a trail of red on the ground. Yet he didn't dare stop. The woman beside him was relying on him to get her to safety, and that responsibility pushed him forward, step by painful step. They moved cautiously, staying close to the ruined structures for cover. The village had once been a bustling community, but now it was a maze of destruction, with nothing but the sound of distant explosions and the occasional rattle of gunfire to break the silence. Jackson's eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, looking for any signs of movement, any indication that the enemy might be near. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, not just from the physical exertion, but from the anxiety that gnawed at him. Every corner, every shadow could conceal danger. Every sound could be the last thing they heard. The woman's breathing had become shallow, her movements slower as the pain from her injuries began to take its toll. Jackson glanced at her, his concern deepening. Her face was pale, and her eyes, though determined, seemed to grow more distant with each passing minute. He wanted to ask if she was all right, but he knew better. There was no time for questions, no time for anything other than survival. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, no matter the cost. They reached a narrow alleyway between two collapsed buildings, and Jackson stopped to check for any signs of the enemy. His breath came in short, jagged bursts as he crouched down beside the rubble, listening intently. The wind whistled through the debris, carrying the faint echoes of distant gunfire. But other than that, it was silent. For a moment, Jackson allowed himself to relax, just a little. They were safe, for the moment. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a fleeting sense of security. The enemy was always out there, always watching. Jackson gestured for the woman to follow him, and they continued their journey, moving further into the village. The further they went, the more the sounds of war grew louder. The air seemed to hum with tension, each step they took bringing them closer to the unknown. Jackson could feel the weight of the fear pressing in on him, but he pushed it aside. Fear wouldn't save them. Only action, only movement could keep them alive. As they rounded another corner, Jackson froze. A group of soldiers, Japanese by the looks of them, were standing just ahead, seemingly unaware of their presence. They were discussing something, but the language was foreign to Jackson, and he couldn't make out the words. His heart raced, and his mind went into overdrive. They were too close. If they were spotted, it would all be over. The woman beside him looked up at him, her face full of fear and confusion. Jackson raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. He had to think fast. The alleyway they were in offered little cover, and the soldiers would have a clear line of sight if they continued forward. Jackson's mind raced as he searched for an escape route. To his right, there was a narrow gap between two ruined buildings, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. It was risky, but it was their only option. He nodded to the woman, and without a word, they began to move, slowly and silently, hoping to slip by unnoticed. They were almost through the gap when one of the soldiers turned, catching a glimpse of them. Jackson's heart stopped. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The soldier's eyes widened in shock, and before he could shout, Jackson lunged forward, grabbing the woman's arm and pulling her into the narrow space between the buildings. They both stumbled, but Jackson managed to steady them. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he pressed his back against the wall, praying they hadn't been seen. They waited in the silence, holding their breath, every nerve on edge. Jackson's mind was racing, his thoughts a blur. The soldier had seen them. There was no doubt about it. They had to get out of here, and quickly. But they couldn't afford to move too fast. One wrong move, one misstep, and they'd be caught. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Jackson's body ached with tension, but he forced himself to remain still. He could hear the soldiers talking, their voices faint but growing louder. They were getting closer. Jackson knew they didn't have much time. His hand tightened around the woman's arm, signaling that they needed to move. He carefully edged around the corner, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The woman followed closely behind him, her face tense with fear. They moved through the ruins like shadows, avoiding the soldiers at all costs. The danger was palpable, and every step they took seemed to take them further into enemy territory. But Jackson couldn't stop now, not when they were so close to escaping, so close to survival. The war was still raging around them, but for the first time in days he felt a glimmer of hope. They had made it this far. They could make it the rest of the way. The further they moved, the more the sounds of the battlefield faded. The gunfire and explosions grew more distant, replaced by the eerie silence of the village. Jackson didn't stop to question it. They were alive, and that was all that mattered. As they reached the edge of the village, Jackson looked back at the woman. Her face was still full of fear, but there was something else there now, something that hadn't been there before. It was a spark of something: determination, resilience, hope. They had made it this far, and they would make it the rest of the way. Together, they could survive. They had to. The sun had long set by the time Jackson and the woman, whose name he still didn't know, reached the edge of the village. The world around them was dark and silent, save for the distant hum of gunfire and the occasional rumble of artillery. Jackson's body was screaming in pain, his leg barely holding up under the strain of their long journey. But they had made it this far. They were on the verge of escaping, of finding some semblance of safety. But as Jackson paused at the edge of the village, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. He looked back toward the ruins of the village, the place they had just fled from. It was a battlefield, empty and desolate, yet still haunted by the echoes of death and destruction. Jackson knew they weren't safe yet. There were still enemy forces patrolling the area, and even if they managed to get through the next stretch of land unnoticed, there would be no guarantee that they would survive. The path ahead was unclear, but it was the only one left for them to take. He had to keep moving for both of their sakes. The woman, though silent throughout their journey, was now walking slightly ahead of him, her head turned toward the open road in front of them. Her steps were slow but steady, as if she had become accustomed to the weight of the world pressing down on her. Jackson admired her strength. She had survived the horrors of war, just like him, and yet she hadn't let it break her spirit. She moved through the night like someone who had seen too much to be frightened anymore, but was still fighting to survive. They reached the open stretch of land that separated the village from what was supposed to be a safer area. Jackson's instincts told him to slow down, to be cautious, but the woman seemed eager to push forward. He couldn't blame her. They both wanted to be free of the war, to be rid of the constant fear that had gripped their lives for so long. He stayed close behind her, watching the ground for any signs of danger, while his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. They were so close to escape, and yet so far. The land between the village and the safer zone was barren, scorched by the ongoing battles and the constant airstrikes. The ground was cracked and uneven, making every step more difficult than the last. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through him as he pushed himself forward, his body barely keeping up. But he couldn't stop now. They had to keep going. As they crossed the open land, Jackson's mind raced with thoughts of what might be waiting for them on the other side. Were there friendly forces there, or were they still surrounded by enemy lines? What if they were caught in the open, with no place to hide? His doubts gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. There was nothing else to do. Suddenly, the woman stumbled, falling to her knees. Jackson rushed forward, instinctively reaching out to help her. She was gasping for breath, her face pale with exhaustion, and her body trembling. He could see that she was pushing herself beyond her limits, trying to keep up despite the pain and the fatigue. Jackson crouched beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're almost there," he said softly, though his own voice sounded uncertain. He didn't know how much further they could go, but he had to believe they were close to safety. The woman nodded weakly, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. She didn't say anything, but Jackson could see the struggle in her eyes. They were both running on empty, driven by sheer willpower alone. The war had taken so much from them, and they had fought through so much pain and loss. But now, as they neared what seemed like the end of their journey, there was a sense of finality in the air. They had reached the point of no return, and there was no turning back. They continued on, more slowly now, as Jackson supported her every step of the way. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows of the trees and the distant hills blurring into one endless expanse. Jackson kept his focus on the path ahead, his thoughts consumed by the need to survive, to get them both to safety. But even as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence of the night was unnerving, too quiet for comfort. Then, just as they reached the edge of the forest, a sound broke the stillness. The crack of a twig snapping underfoot, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Jackson's heart skipped a beat, and his mind raced to assess the situation. Were they caught? Was this the end? He froze, his body tense, and instinctively pulled the woman closer to him, shielding her with his own body. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. But as the sound grew closer, Jackson realized something was different. The footsteps weren't hostile. They were slow, cautious, and there was no sound of weapons being drawn. He felt a sense of unease, but also relief. Maybe it was a patrol, maybe even friendly forces. But he couldn't take any chances. He slowly turned around, positioning himself between the approaching figure and the woman. A figure emerged from the darkness, and Jackson's breath caught in his throat. It was another soldier, his uniform stained and torn, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He was holding his weapon loosely in one hand, and his movements were deliberate, cautious. The man stopped when he saw Jackson, his eyes narrowing in recognition. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. Then, the soldier lowered his weapon and stepped forward, his expression softening. "You're alive," he said, his voice hoarse, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. Jackson didn't know how to respond. He was still on edge, unsure if this was a trap or if they had finally found their salvation. But the soldier's presence, however unexpected, was a reminder that they weren't alone in this hell. There were others out there, others who had survived just as they had. Jackson stood there, uncertain of what would happen next, but knowing one thing for sure, they were not out of danger yet. The war was still raging, and survival was no guarantee. But for the first time in a long time, he felt the slightest flicker of hope. They had made it this far, and with the help of the stranger before him, maybe, just maybe, they could make it all the way.